Let's walk through the book of Genesis just to see how God works in humanity. We'll separate it into essentially two sections: a primeval history and a patriarchal history. Um, Primeval history is the world's backstory, covering creation, the first humans, the entry of sin, a massive flood, and why we have different languages and nations. Patri- Patriarchal history is zooming in on the family line, talking about a man named Abraham and how God makes incredible promises to his family, and then we see his faithfulness at work through generations, even when people mess up. So the primeval history, God's original design and humanity's early choices from Genesis 1 to 11. God spoke and made the light, the sky, the land, the plants, the sun, the moon, the stars, animals, and finally humans with Adam and Eve. In 6 days he created, and on the seventh day he rested from all his creations. So we see how God intentionally designed Adam, making him from dust, forming him out of dust, blow into him, give him breath and the spirit of him, created in the image of God. And God refers to, let us create man in the image, in our image, suggesting plural. That's another thing that to take note of. But then he made Eve from the rib of Adam, which is why women are called woman, because it's like you got the image. But God rested on the seventh day from all his creation, and then he set a pattern for rest and relationship. So we have to take a look at God's character, which was revealed throughout his creation, is that God is all powerful. He's omnipotent. He creates the entire universe with just his words. And just understand when I say his words, he just says, let there be light. He doesn't even say, let there be a sun that shines and, all of this stuff. He just says, let there be light. And his words, so powerful, understands the order of his intellect to form the creation in all of the intricate design. And so he is all powerful. His words alone did everything. So he's also creative and orderly. His creation shows beautiful designs and purpose. He's good. God repeatedly declares his creation as good. And one of the most significant part of his creation he calls very good. And that is when he made human. Um, he's also relational. He creates human in his image. And desiring fellowship with us, and he provides everything that we need. Then came the fall, when things kind of started to go wrong. Adam and Eve were given one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Yet a serpent came, representing Satan, attempts, he tempts Eve, who eats the fruit and then gave it to Adam. And this was seen as an act of disobedience from God. That was the nature of sin that entered. The disobedience was the sin. It wasn't so much the act of eating the fruit that was sinful, but it was the disobedience from God's word that says, do not eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that became the fall of humanity, and the first act of sin was entered. Um, so Adam and Eve, as we know, experienced a lot of shame and fear and were eventually banished from the Garden of Eden. So even though they represented shame and fear and they hid from God, you are going to see God's character is that he comes seeking relationship. Even though they sinned, God comes looking for them in the garden, asking, "Where are you?" This shows God's desire to connect. He's also holy and just. Sin has consequences. So God is holy and he cannot ignore disobedience, he cannot ignore sin. So the separation from God and the curses are a result of the choices that were made by Adam and Eve. When God curses Eve in labor and causes her pain to be multiplied, until this day, women experience a lot of pain in childbirth. Um, so he's also merciful and graceful. He's gracious and he's merciful. Even in judgment, God shows mercy. He provides clothes for Adam and Eve to alleviate their anxiety and shame from now recognizing that they were naked, and before they were comfortable with each other in nakedness. But they saw the shame, their eyes were open to evil, and so they saw the shame of their nakedness, for which they should have not known. But God provided them clothes. And crucially, he provides a future redeemer as well, who will crush the serpent. And this was one of the first example of a redeemer, the first example of the gospel coming about Jesus Christ, that there is this redeemer that's going to come to crush the head of the serpent. So Adam had Cain and Abel, his first sons, and then sin continued down the line and spread. God provides favor over Abel's offering, over Cain's offering. So provides favor to Abel's offering over Cain's offering. And Cain saw that and became angry, and the sin of jealousy entered his heart, and he decided to murder his brother Abel. So think about God's character even in this moment. God is completely just. As much as he's merciful and graceful, he's also a just God. So he held Cain accountable for his actions in Genesis 4:9-12, but yet still merciful. Even while punishing Cain, God puts a mark on him to protect him from being killed. This shows that God doesn't give up on humanity entirely. God sees and knows. He's aware of our hearts and our actions, so you cannot hide and you cannot escape. So God became very grieved. Going on from Genesis 6-9, he became very grieved by how wicked humanity became. Humanity became incredibly wicked, and he felt he needed to cleanse the earth of its wickedness. People often point to this as God being wicked when he decided to flood the earth and destroy entirety of humanity. But it was the disobedience, the incredible sin that people were doing against God, and he's the sovereign God, and the incredible amount of sin and gruesome evil that was going on. He just was, you cannot thwart God's anger when he's angry. And he's slow to anger, and he's patient, and he did all of this, but these people still was so wicked and disobedient. So God caused a flood to wipe out humanity. But even then, he saw favor in Noah as a righteous man, not even a sinless, a righteous man that was blameless among the people of his time. And his family, he allowed Noah's family to be along with him. He instructed Noah to build an ark and to bring animals on board and his family on board as well. So the flood covers the earth, and afterwards God makes a covenant with Noah. He made a promise. A covenant is a promise and an agreement. He made a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy all life with a flood. And the symbol of that covenant was actually the rainbow. And today, the rainbow is used as something else. But this was the original example of the rainbow. It's the covenant, it's the promise that was made with Noah. So look at God's character revealed. Holy and righteous. God cannot just let extreme sin go rampant, unchecked, indefinitely. It also shows that he was grieved. In Genesis 6:6, he was grieved. It shows that he doesn't have delight in judgment, but is pained by sin. God is just. So that was the flood. He had to wipe out widespread evil and wickedness because he's a just God, just as much as he's faithful and merciful. So he's faithful and merciful. He provides a way of salvation as well to Noah and his family, providing humanity another chance and life for animals. He is also a covenant keeping God. He makes a binding promise and shows his desire for a stable relationship with his creation. So, the Tower of Babel, where pride and dispersion happened. So people were speaking one language at that time, but they tried to build a massive tower. As they all speak the same language and could understand each other and work together, they built a massive tower. But that was an act of disobedience. They were avoiding to be scattered when God was scattering them among nations to multiply, to go and be fruitful and multiply. They built that tower in a disobedience, not wanting to be scattered. And this was opposing God's command to fill the earth. So God decided to confuse their languages that none of them could understand each other, which caused them to all be scattered across the earth. So what is the character of God in this? Well, it shows that God is sovereign. He's sovereign. He is in control. His promises will prevail. His will prevail. Human pride cannot ultimately thwart his plan. He shows his wisdom, his action. While a judgment on their pride was done, he also facilitates his own original plan for humanity to spread and populate the earth. So now we're looking at the patriarchal history. God's covenant with a family. Genesis 12-50. This zone in on one man whose name was Abram, later known as Abraham. And then we see this special covenant, this relationship that eventually leads to the blessing of the whole world. So Abraham is known as like the father of faith. Genesis 12-25. So God called Abram, to leave his home and go to a land that he will show him, promising him to make him into a great nation, to bless him, to make him a great name, and through him that all people on earth would be blessed. So this was a huge promise. Abraham obeys, though he faced like many challenges and sometimes doubts. So some key moments is that God formalized his covenant. Then there was this miraculous birth of Isaac, the son of Abraham, in Genesis 21, 1-7. And there was an ultimate test of Abraham's faith. You see now, this reveals that God will first test you before he carries out his will with you, to see if you are going to be somebody with the heart to hold strong to his command. So he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his son. What is the character of God in this? Is that God is the initiator. He takes the first step in relationship, calling Abraham, pointing out to him that he will have this covenant with him, have this relationship with him, have these things with him. He initiated that. He's a promise keeper. He's a promise maker. He's faithful. So despite all the delays and humans' weakness, such as Abraham lying about his wife, Sarah, he laughs at the promise of having a son in his old age, as well as Sarah. But God remains faithful to his words. He's gracious. He chooses Abraham, not because Abraham was perfect, but out of his own good purpose. He's a provider. He provides a ram to be sacrificed instead of Isaac. Instead of Isaac, as he is about to carry through, he just wanted to test this faith. Not that he needed to kill his son, but it's the faith that God wanted to see before, he walked him into the will, his promise. Can he keep his faith when tested? So, he provides what's needed. And he's very patient. He's a patient God. He works with Abraham over many decades. So Isaac was the promised son that God came to Abraham and Sarah, his wife, to tell them that he will have this son called Isaac. They did laugh at God, saying, "Oh, am I to have a son in my old age?" And Sarah also laughed at God about this, but here came Isaac, just as told and just as promised. So Isaac's life was a little less dramatic than Abraham, but he's a vital link to the covenant made with Abraham. So we see God providing Isaac with a wife, Rebekah, in Genesis 24, and blessing him. He has two sons named Esau and Jacob. So God's is faithful to his creation. God's covenant continues through Isaac, showing his long-term plans. He provides guidance. The story of finding his wife, Rebekah, shows God's subtle guiding evidence as well, and subtle guiding events. He's sovereign in his choices. He declares that the older Esau, the son of Isaac, was the elder one, Esau, will be serving the younger one, Jacob, even before they were even born. In Genesis 25:23, even before they were even born, he declared that. And this is actually against the customs of those times, where the firstborn would actually be given, the firstborn right. And and favor. But God instructed against that custom. Now, Jacob was the younger one, um, and he was a struggler who was transformed. He was kind of a trickster, the deceiver, and he deceived his brother Esau out of his birthright and blessing. This is a younger brother deceiving the older brother out of his birthright and blessing. He flees Esau and has a powerful dream about Bethel, who God confirms the covenant with. God works for many years. He works for many years with Laban, and then he marries Leah and Rachel, and had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. This is also another point of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. And Jacob had to wrestle with God. He wrestled with God, and his name actually changed from Jacob to Israel. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, and Israel just means he wrestles with God. So look at God's character into this. He's patient, he's persistent. God doesn't just give up on Jacob despite his flaws and his deception. He's a transformer. He makes Jacob, he meets him in his brokenness. He meets him in his brokenness and then changes him over in time. The name change was significant to change him into Israel. God is faithful to his covenant. When Jacob is running away, God reaffirms his promises to him. He works through imperfect people. God uses Jacob, flawed and all, just to continue his covenant plan. Now, Joseph was another pivotal person in this. Joseph is like from the pits to the palace. There was an example of forgiveness and providence through the story with Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. He favored him, which makes his brothers jealous. Well, now, what does this remind you of? Doesn't it remind you of Cain and Abel, and how Abel had jealousy in his heart after God favors the offering from Abel over his offering? Jealousy. So that came down in history, came down in generation here. So Joseph's brothers were jealous of him, and they sold him into slavery into Egypt. But despite this terrible injustice and being falsely accused and imprisoned, Joseph remained faithful to God. Never cursed God, he remained faithful. So God gives him many blessings. God gives him the ability to interpret dreams, and he eventually interpreted the dream that brought him to the hand of Pharaoh, essentially. And Pharaoh, because he was looking for a faithful man, and Joseph was the most faithful man that he could find despite being his prisoner, he chose him to be a second command in Egypt. Essentially, the prince, second command in Egypt. And this, through Joseph, was him to save the nations. And he saved them from severe famine, for Egypt was very rich. He saved them from severe famine. So during the famine, his brothers came to Egypt to get food. And after a series of tests, Joseph reveals himself to them because they couldn't recognize that he was this prince, this person. They didn't recognize him at first when they came there and saw him, but he recognized them. And he ran them through a couple of tests. And when he reveals himself, instead of cursing them, he actually forgives them. And he brings his entire family to live in Egypt. So the book ends with Joseph reaffirming God's overreaching plan in all that happened. So what's God's character in this? It shows that God is sovereign and provident, and this is a key theme about God. He's working behind the scenes, even through human sin and suffering, to achieve his good purposes. Joseph saying to his brothers that you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, to accomplish, being done. And through Joseph, who was happy, he managed to have saved many lives through this famine. And so, he's present with his people. God was with Joseph in slavery and in prison. He's redemptive. God brings good out of bad situation and uses Joseph to preserve the covenant family. He inspires forgiveness. Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers is a powerful picture about God's own forgiving nature. So, what have we learned overall in Genesis about God's character? One, he's a creator. He's powerful, he's intentional, and he is the source of all life. He is sovereign. He's in ultimate control, and his plans will not be thwarted. He's holy, he's pure, and he's separate from sin. He is just. He deals rightly with sin, and there are consequences for actions, against God, which is sin. He's merciful and he's gracious. He shows undeserved kindness and compassion, often providing a way forward even after failure. He's faithful. He's a covenant keeper. He makes promises and he keeps them, even when people are unfaithful. He's a provider. He meets the needs of his creation and his people. He's redemptive. He works to bring good out of bad situation and restore what is broken. He is relational. He desires a relationship with humanity. He seeks us out and communicates with us. And he is patient. He works with flawed people over long periods of time to accomplish his purpose.